and Daf. This is Elana Stein, Hain. So last week we talked about whether one isur, whether one prohibition can layer over another prohibition. That's really about mitzvot and averot from the Torah. What we're going to talk about this week is whether you can make a decree upon a decree. As the Gemara this week, Chullin, Kuf Dalid, Amud Aleph, and Amud Bet, 104, 105a, tells us we are not supposed to make a decree on a decree, right? And in fact, it asks this question in relation to why it is that one wouldn't be permitted to put a piece of chicken on the same table as something dairy, as milk. And the Gemara says, Rav Yosef says, Shema Mina, it teaches us that Bisar Of B'chalav D'oraita, it must be that eating cooked chicken and milk together is a biblical prohibition. Because if you think it's Rabbanan, which by the way, we do think it's rabbinic, the achila gufa, eating it itself, is only a gezerah, is only a decree, only quote unquote, meaning a rabbinic decree. Va'anan nigzar ha'ala atu achila, and are we going to add another decree, namely that you can't put it on the same table because of the potential for eating? And the Gemara goes into this conversation about where we learn in Gozrin Gezerah al Gezerah from. The idea that the rabbis are not supposed to make a decree upon something that is only asur to begin with, is only prohibited to begin with because of a decree. Now, what I want to do is I want to spend some time thinking about the logic behind this, and of course the exceptions would sometimes help us understand the logic. So the first thing I just want to mention is that having learned the Gemara, you notice that the Gemara was very clear that when we're talking about a gezerah, a decree, we're generally talking about a decree that was made in order to safeguard an isur d'oraita, a biblical prohibition, such as biblically red meat and milk cannot be cooked together or eaten together cooked. Biblically, and then rabbinically, we add a gezerah, we have a decree that even chicken and milk cannot. And then the question is, can you add another gezerah onto that, saying they can't even be put onto the table together? But you have to notice that it all starts with a deoraita. It all starts with a biblical violation that we are trying to keep people from doing. If there's no biblical prohibition there to begin with, then it would be obvious that you would not make a decree, okay? So I want to look at just some perspectives on the logic behind this. Now the first thing, and this is a little bit frustrating to me, there is a tshuva, there is a responsum from Gaonic times, right? Gaonic times are like 8th century to 10th century of the Common Era, and there's a tshuva called Chemda Genuza from Rav Sar Shalom Gaon, who is, I think, a 9th century Gaon, where he talks about you can't make a gezerah on a gezerah because ein la davar sof. It'll never end. You can always make another decree on another decree on another decree to keep people from violating. And therefore, that's the logic of ein gozrin gezerah al gezerah. The reason why I'm frustrated is because I couldn't find the text itself. I saw a number of people quoting it in their modern day shiurim online. I was unable to get a physical copy or even a digital copy in my hands of that tshuva. If anybody can, please do me a favor and do so. There is another place that people suggest is actually the source for ein gozrin gezerah al gezerah, and that is not, it's not logic per se. Doesn't mean it's not logical, but it's not about logic per se. And I want to look at that source. So some people say it is, and just moving us to read mode. Some people say it's from Vayikra, Perek Yud Chet, chapter 18, Pasuk Lamed, chapter 30. And this is at the end of the list of arayot, of illegitimate sexual unions, prohibited sexual unions. Ushmartem et mishmarti. You shall keep my keeping. You shall guard my guarding, right? Levilti asot, so as not to do mechukot hatoevot asher nasu lifnechem, from the abominable practices that have been done before you, meaning in the land of Israel by those Canaanite nations. V'lo titamu bahem, and you should not become, I would say, spiritually defiled by them. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am the Lord your God. Now, in a few places, the Gemara cites ushmartem et mishmarti, meaning asu mishmeret lemishmarti. You should make a guard for my mishmeret, my guarding, okay? Now, it's interesting, the English here says my prized possession, which I think is beautiful, meaning something that God protects. So Rav Kahana, for example, in Yevamot Kaf Aleph Amud Aleph, says the whole list of shniot la'arayot, forbidden sexual liaisons that are of a secondary nature, meaning they're not written in the Torah, but they're rabbinically forbidden. Sometimes they're rabbinically forbidden because they're a good siag, they're a good fence to keep you from getting to the biblical prohibition, like a man not being allowed to sleep with his grandmother, Rahman al-Itzlan, obviously, because then, God forbid, he would sleep with his mother, which is a biblical prohibition, right? So, asu mishmeret lemishmarti, you should make another guard, meaning a rabbinic guarding, around that which I have already guarded, says God, right? Around Torah, essentially. You have a similar thing in Moed Katan, Daf Hey Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Moed Katan is talking about the requirement to actually mark burial areas, graves, so that people who are coming on Aliyah Regel, people who are coming on pilgrimage, will not become tameh, right? Will not become ritually defiled, especially if they're trying to go to the Beit HaMikdash. That would not be a good time for them to become ritually defiled. So Mar Zutra says, I'll tell you where I know this from, and he quotes a pasuk from the end of Vayikra 15, which, by the way, that chapter in Vayikra is all about Tuma and Tahara, ritual purity and ritual impurity. But Rav Ashi says, no, it's from our pasuk, Ushmartem et Mishmarti, right? Now, Ushmartem et Mishmarti, we know, is taken from the end of the list of sexual liaisons that are forbidden. So the Gemara in Yevamot that's using it to say even secondary arayot, forbidden sexual liaisons, come from this pasuk, Asu Mishmeret Lemishmarti. Here, Asu Mishmeret Lemishmarti is going to be used to even talk about something that has nothing to do with forbidden sexual relations. It has to do with just helping people stay away from Tuma, ritual defilement. Asu Mishmeret Lemishmarti. You should mark off, you should be marking off graves in order to make sure that people don't become tameh, and, that could lead to them making truma tameh, for example, or even making the mikdash tameh in some way. So, but again, what's happening here is the term ushmartem et mishmarti, you should make a safeguard around that which I guard, says God. What Rashi does with this is Rashi says you should make one extra ushmartem, not a mishmeret to a mishmeret. You don't make two gzerot, meaning God's law, the biblical law, is what you're trying to protect. But to make an additional decree in order to protect the rabbinic law, which in the first place is quote-unquote only there, in order to protect the rabbinic law, that is not required. So that is another way that people explain why that we're not supposed to have a gezerah on a gezerah. That actually the idea is we're supposed to be safeguarding God's law. We don't need to be safeguarding the law that we created to safeguard God's law. Now, that could still go back to the logic of the Sar Shalom Gaon, of eventually in L'Davar Sof, but people like to make distinctions among these things, but I'll just leave it there. What I think is equally interesting is that the Tosfot right there in Chullin say, I have to tell you, B'yesh mekomot nami, there are places, tigazrinan gzera l'gzera, where we do actually make a decree on a decree. V'lo chayshinan, and we don't worry about this problem of not making one gzera on another. So he says, ein lidamot gzerot chachamim zo lezo, ela b'mkomot shehashas midameh. Says, I'm going to go with the following principle. You should not compare one decree to another among rabbinic decrees unless the Gemara does it itself. In other words, just because we won't make a decree on a decree in situation A doesn't mean we won't make a decree on a decree in situation B. So I want to actually think about these places where we're either willing to make a gzera on a gzera, or we're arguing somehow that it's not a gzera on a gzera. So let's actually go to another example in Shas, in the Talmud, where we talk about the responsibility not to make a decree upon another decree, and then we find a way to say that that's not what we're doing. So the Mishnah says, Beitza shenolda b'yom tov, if literally a chicken laid an egg on a festival, Beit Shammai omrim te'achel, Beit Shammai says, no problem, it's edible. Ubeit Hillel omrim lo te'achel. And Beit Hillel says, it is not permissible to eat. Now the Gemara in Beitza tries to figure out what is the reason. What is the reason? Why wouldn't Beit Hillel allow you to eat it? And one of the explanations that's offered, Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef says, Gzeira mishum perot hanoshrin. The reason why Beit Hillel would not allow you, derabanan, rabbinically, to eat an egg that was laid on Yom Tov itself, is it's a decree so that in the case of a fruit that falls from a tree on Yom Tov, you won't eat that fruit that falls from a tree. But then Abaye says, Amar le Abaye says, Perot hanoshrin ta'amamai. What's the reason why you are not allowed to eat fruit that falls from a tree on Yom Tov, by the way, or on Shabbat? Gzeira shema ya'aleh v'yitlosh. It's a decree because we're worried that a person will climb the tree and pull down the fruit. So let me get this straight. What you're telling me is you're not allowed to eat, according to Beit Hillel, an egg that was laid on Yom Tov as a decree rabbinically, so that you don't eat a fruit that falls from a tree on Yom Tov, which is prohibited rabbinically because we're worried that you'll do something biblically wrong, namely pull fruit off the tree on Yom Tov, or Shabbat for that matter. But wait a second. He gufa gzeira. The whole issue of not eating a fruit that falls from the tree on Yom Tov is itself, quote unquote, only a rabbinic decree. Va'anan nekum v'nigzor gzeira l'gzeira. Now we're going to add another decree on that you're not allowed to eat an egg that was laid on Yom Tov because we're worried that you might then eat a fruit that fell on Yom Tov? So the Gemara says, no. Kula chada gzerahi. No, don't think about it that way. It's actually all one gezerah. The fruit falling and the egg being laid are supposed to be understood as one gezerah. The Gemara goes on a little bit more. Rabbi Yitzchak Amar, Gzera mishum mashkin shezavu. Actually, I think the reason why Beit Hillel won't allow you to eat an egg that was laid on Yom Tov is because the concern is for liquids that separated out from a fruit. They leaked out of a fruit, and you shouldn't eat those either, drink those either on Yom Tov. Amar le Abaye, once again, Abaye says, but wait a second. Mashkin shazavu tamamai. Why are you not allowed to drink the liquid that leaked from a fruit? Gezerah shema yischot, because we're worried that you might do something biblically prohibited on Yom Tov, again, or on Shabbos for that matter, namely squeeze the juice on purpose out of the fruit. But he gufa gezerah, so eating the fruit, drinking the liquid, is itself only a rabbinic decree. And now we're going to come and say, we're going to add another decree on that you can't eat an egg that was laid on Yom Tov because we're worried that then you'll drink liquid that seeped out of fruit on Yom Tov. That's a gezerah on a gezerah. Kula chad gezerah. No, it's all one gezerah. So the first thing we have to notice here is that what it's basically saying is, Ein gozrin gezerah al gezerah, you don't make a decree on a decree if what we're really talking about is making a decree on something that is 1 degree separated from the other decree. But here, the decrees are really the same. What basically categorically we're saying is something of food stuff that emerges from its host. On Yom Tov, we don't partake of. Why? Because it might come to have us violate a deoraita. What would the deoraita be? It would be trying to physically make that food stuff come out. True, we're not going to do that in the case of a chicken, but in the case of other things that are in that same category of a food stuff that emerges from its host, we might violate a biblical prohibition of schita, of squeezing juice from its host solid into something separate. And by the way, parentheses, I'm just going to say into something separate as opposed to into another solid that can absorb it, but that's for another time. Or we might actually try to pick the fruit off the tree. But the category of the gezerah is one. And yes, it's a little more expansive. So that's one way to say not everything is the same when we say ein gozrin gezerah al gezerah. Not everything, it doesn't always mean that there can't be more expansiveness to the gezerah. It's that it can't be two separate categorical gezerot. Here's another example where it's trying to explain to us what it would mean to have two gezerot that are kind of, if not conceptually, at least pragmatically are one. Meaning they're two gezerot, but you can't really have one without the other. And that is the law of hatmana. Now the law of hatmana, of not insulating foodstuffs to heat it up or to preserve its heat, is described in the Mishnah in Shabbat, Perek Daled Mishnah Aleph, by describing what you are allowed to insulate your food within on Erev Shabbat. Bamet tomnin ubamet ein tomnin. What are you allowed to insulate in, and what are you not allowed to insulate in? And the description goes essentially, anything that is going to just preserve the heat, you can insulate in the food in that on Erev Shabbat. But anything that is going to add to the insulation, to add to the heat, you may not. Now, we're going to see why that is, okay? Now, obviously, not being allowed to do that on Erev Shabbat is a rabbinic decree. So the Rambam, in his explanation of that Mishnah, tells us, first of all, V'da, you should know, Kizot hatmana shehu medaber ba she'asrua b'dvarim v'hitirua b'dvarim. This whole conversation of what materials are you allowed to insulate the food in and what materials are you not, Kimoshe Iskir, he Erev Shabbat. That's only about Friday. Aval biyom Shabbat, but on Shabbos itself, lo hitir hatmanat davar cham. You are not allowed to insulate anything hot on Shabbos. Aval yatmin b'Shabbat hatav shel hakar bilvad. You can only insulate something cold that is cooked. Now, I want to just point out the translation is mistaken here. I'm going to fix it before we put this up on the web. Kasherit be'er b'zeh parak, as will be explained in this chapter. V'adat hayam mechayev. I might have thought shetiyah atmana b'Shabbat b'davar she'eno mosif muteret. I might have thought, hey, why can't we insulate food that is hot on Shabbos in something that just preserves the heat? Vehem hadvarim she'amra haMishnah tomnin bahem mutar. Right? Those are the things that the Mishnah listed that on Erev Shabbat, on Friday, you are allowed to insulate in. Things that preserve the heat rather than raise the heat. Aval asruha, but they prohibited it on Shabbos. Why? Shema yatmin beremetz. Because we are worried if you start by putting your food to insulate it in something that preserves its heat, maybe you'll move on to insulating it in an ember, a glowing ember. Behu ha'efer hacham, that is hot ashes. Why? Lefi shehu eno mosif, because it doesn't add heat. Ve'asarnu ha'atmana be'efer hacham, but we don't allow you to insulate in hot ashes, mipachdenu, because of our fear, shetyeh ba gachelet eish ktana, just in case there might be a little coal in there left in the ashes. Uve'et shemini'im ha'efer, and when you're moving the ashes, yechateh b'gechalim, you will stir the coals and you will violate, actually causing fire, havara, on Shabbos. Ulafichach, and therefore, lo hitiru hatmana b'Shabbos, they did not allow insulating hot food on Shabbat, ve'afilu b'davar she'eno mosif, even in something that only preserves heat and does not raise heat, mishum gezerat remetz, because we are worried about the possibility of you using something that preserves heat that's specifically an ember or like hot ashes, and that gezerah, that is decreed that you shouldn't use it shema yachateh b'gechalim, because we're worried that there might be a piece of coal in there, and when you move it around, you are going to actually be creating fire, which is a biblical violation. So I want you to notice, sounds to me like what's being said here is you can't insulate hot food on Shabbos, even in things that only preserve heat, because decree that maybe you'll put it in a specific type of thing that preserves heat, namely hot ashes, and in those hot ashes, maybe there will be a coal in there, and you will move the coal and stir the coal, and thus you will be creating, you will actually be igniting or reigniting some sort of fire, which is biblical. Sounds like a gzera to me, right? So the Rambam says, but wait, ve'ulai takshe, maybe you're going to say, no. You're going to challenge. Be'ikar shehu etzleinu, based on the principle of ein gozer gzera l'gzera, that you're not allowed to have a decree on a decree. So he says, no. V'hu she'igzru beitin davar b'sha'ah min hasha'ot. That's only when Beitin made a decree at some point. Ve'achar kach, and afterwards, Yashuv v'yigzor gzera le'otah gzera. They came back and made an additional decree. Zeh hadavar einam osim. That the rabbis are not supposed to do. Aval, but im yiyu shtei hagzerot b'sha'ah achat. If both of those gzerot are at the same time, they're simultaneous, harishut bi'adam, it's allowed. V'hu davar ne'asa tamid, and that happens all the time. V'hu inyan omram, and that is the meaning of when Chazal say kulhu chad gzerahi. It's all one decree. Ritzon lomar, meaning ki mi shegazar zot hagzera, the one who made this decree, right? Namely, the decree not to use hot ash to insulate the food, just in case there might be coal in there and you might ignite it, which is a biblical prohibition. You might ignite it when you're moving around. You might ignite, reignite some of the whatever. Ra'asha lo titkayem zot hagzera, they realized that it's not possible for people to uphold this gezerah, ela b'gzera acheret, unless they had another decree techazekota v'tismochota, that is propping it up. Meaning they realized it's maybe too unreasonable to expect that people really won't use ash if they're allowed to use other things that preserve heat on Shabbat to insulate. So what does it mean, kula chad gzerahi? It's not realistic to keep people from using this hot ash. It's only realistic if we add another gzera, which is you're not allowed to use anything to preserve heat in an insulating manner on Shabbat, right? So that's chad gzera. So simultaneously they make both, because practically they're concerned that the gzera that they care about is not really going to be kept without adding another gzera at the same time. Therefore, they did two at once. So you see, it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit different. I think the case with an egg that is hatched on Yontif and fruit that falls out of a tree or liquid that seeps out of fruit, I think to say those are all the same gzera is to say, well, conceptually speaking, they're all the same thing, right? They are a foodstuff that emerges from a host, right? So it's all one gzera. Here, I think it's more practically it's one gzera, because they don't think that the gzera of decreeing that you're not allowed to use hot ash to insulate is actually going to stand up. It needs a surrounding gzera of don't preserve anything in heat through insulation on Shabbos, right? So I think very, very interesting. I want to do one more example, and this is another fun example. Like we've actually, we've now looked at, guess what we would call Isser Nolad, right? Or kind of a muktzah, meaning something that was created and introduced into the world ultimately, because that's the way we explain Beitza Shanolda B'Yom Tov, the way we explain an egg that was laid on Shabbat. It's for another time. We've looked at the prohibition of hatmana, the prohibition of insulating food in a heat-preserving mechanism, in an insulating way on Shabbat. And now we're going to look at not making milchix bread. You notice, I don't, email me if you've ever bought challah that looks like your regular Shabbos challah that is dairy. Reason why you haven't, likely, have even seen it, is because of what the Shulchan Aruch tells us here. Ein lashin isa b'chalav, you should not knead dough in dairy. Shema yavo la'ochla im basar, because we're worried that you will eat it with meat. V'im lash kol hapat asur, and if you did, the whole thing is off limits. Afilu le'ochla levada, even to eat it without any other food. You hear what just happened? There's a gzera. You can't make food. You can't make bread dairy. And there's a gzera to the gzera. You can't even eat it on its own, even without anything else. Right? Something like that. And then the Gemara, and then the Shulchan Aruch, continues and says, look, if it can be eaten in one bite, that's fine. Or if you make it look different from the usual pariv challah, right? That's why I'm saying I doubt you've ever seen milchik's challah that looks like challah. If you can make it look different so that people know that it's not just the regular, and they'll know not to eat it with meat, then that's fine. So the Pri Megadim, Rav Yosef Te'omim, in the 18th century, he says, you're not allowed to eat it even by itself if it's dairy challah. Because we're worried in basar, we're worried that you're going to eat it with meat. After havarak d'Rabbanan, even though we know that the issue here of not making it is rabbinic in nature. Mikol makom, at any rate, lo have gzera l'gzera. This is not a double decree. The fact that you're not allowed to eat it even on its own. Dikarov litot, or karov litaut. It's easy to make this mistake. She'al lechem yechia adam. People eat bread all the time. V'darkol le'achol im basar v'chalav u'besamim. People eat it with meat. They eat it with milk. They eat it with spices of all kinds. So what the Pri Megadim is basically saying is, I don't mind having an extra gzera here. The reason I don't mind having an extra gzera is because, what? If you're going to let people eat it, they're going to come to eat it with meat. It's too hard. It doesn't work in real life. It doesn't work in real life. We're not going to get caught in this sort of technical, robotic, ein goes from gzera l'gzera. We're not allowed to make a decree on a decree, so we're not going to make a decree on a decree. Even though, if we let people eat it on its own, of course they're going to come to eat it with meat, or of course they're going to come to eat it with whatever, right? So that's another piece. It's like have some common sense. Instead of ein goes from gzera l'gzera being something, that's formalistic to the extent that never can we cross that, I think we've seen in Gozun Gzera, sure, there's a certain logic in not being too Gzera happy. That's probably not too good for Halakha if you just keep building, right? We have this concept, Kol Mosif Goreh. The more you add, anybody who adds, they end up taking away. People become rebellious, people don't know what's the difference between what's truly Asur and what you just added and all the things. So we try to keep it narrow. But there definitely are times when it's actually really important to be realistic about how people make their decisions, how people associate one thing with another. If I'm allowed to eat it by itself, of course I can eat it with something else, right? If I'm allowed to take this food that came out of its host, I should be allowed to eat that food that came out of its host, right? Meaning, so there's a little bit of common sense that we're trying to add here. Thanks, everybody. Love learning with you as always.